For the Love Gun Tour, which began in Canada in early July 1977 after the album was released, we had a private airplane for the first time. We'd flown private only one time before when, because of a scheduling conflict, we had to take a tiny Learjet to get in and out of some out-of-the-way city. This was different. This was ours. It was a Convair 280, a propeller plane filled with odd furniture, almost like a flying junk shop. The pilot and co-pilot were Dick and Chuck, and our flight attendant was named Judy. Dick and Chuck fought regularly and often yelled at each other in the cockpit, "You asshole, fuck you!" It wasn't very reassuring. Once at the end of a flight, we landed, got to the end of the runway, turned around, and immediately took off again. They had put us down at the international airport rather than the private airport. Another day I saw flames coming out of one of the engines mid-flight. I told Judy to bring Dick back to see it. He came back, looked out the window, and said matter-of-factly, "Don't worry about it." Then he returned to the cockpit. The whole operation was an accident waiting to happen. The tour itself, however, went gangbusters. We had to add dates in a lot of markets and recorded another live album, a live 2, along the way. It seemed like a good idea. We'd done 3 studio albums and a live album, and then another 3 studio albums. Why not another live album? The problem was we had to fabricate a Kiss show for the album because we didn't want to repeat material from the first live album. The first one documented a standard set. The second one couldn't because a lot of those songs from the first 3 albums were still staples in our show. So now we had to create a Kiss show that didn't really exist, with the dynamics of a real show. Even so, it didn't seem like a big deal since we had a lot of great stuff. Detroit Rock City, Love Gun, God of Thunder. And once again, we enhanced the ambient quality of the live recordings so they replicated the bedlam of an actual show. The onstage explosions caused compression in the microphone, so again, we used recordings of cannons to make them sound right. And for the back photo, we decided to take a shot during sound check at the San Diego Sports Arena with all our effects shot off at once. Just blast the entire arsenal and have us all up on the hydraulic lifts. That never actually happened all at the same time during a show, but it was an authentic documentation of the bombastic feel of the experience. The second problem with Alive 2 flowed from the first. Using only songs from the second 3 studio albums, the new live album took up just 3 sides of a double album, not 4. What were we going to do? We decided to add a side of studio tracks. I wasn't keen on the idea. We recorded the tracks at the Capitol Theater in Passaic, New Jersey to give them a live feel. I had All American Man, which I'd written with Sean Delaney, but overall, the songs we came up with just weren't great. Any Way You Want It was a Dave Clark 5 song I'd always loved, and Gene loved it too. The original 1964 version is cataclysmic, just huge. Ours didn't come close, but we needed to fill up that final side of the record. Ace didn't play on any of the studio tracks except the one he wrote, Rocket Ride. Instead, we had to use Bob Kulick, who had auditioned for the band during the Cattle Call back in 1972 and with whom I'd remained friends. As the tour continued, we flew on with Dick and Chuck fighting in the cockpit. During the time Uriah Heep was opening for us, I constantly made eye contact with their keyboard player's great-looking girlfriend. I found out her name was Linda, and the day after the band left our tour, I called our tour agent and said, "Track that girl down." The next day, she was back on the tour, now traveling with me. This was rock and roll. In Houston, someone showed me a 1958 Flying V guitar, which was something I really wanted. It even had its original case. I asked how much he wanted for it. $3,600, the guy said. Come on, that's a lot of money. He didn't budge. I bought the guitar. I had caught the guitar bug again. In California, someone told me about a guy who had a Sunburst Les Paul for sale. I paid $10,000 for it. It seemed like a fortune at the time, but it ended up on the cover of the Bible of Sunburst Guitars, The Beauty of the Burst, and is valued at as much as $1 million now. Best of all, that guitar is still known as the Stanley Burst, even though I no longer own it. By the end of the Love Gun tour, I had 9 premiere examples of guitars I loved, including the ones I'd already bought. The demand for Kiss concert tickets continued to rise through the year, and being on stage continued to suspend everything around me. Performing provided pure escapism and joy and elation. In my everyday life, I could never free myself of my insecurities, and the increasing rancor inside the band left me feeling more isolated than ever. One night, I even decided I should try the rock star thing of breaking up a room, but as soon as I started breaking things, I stopped. What did I do that for? The room's messy now. This is my room. Now I have to clean it up. But as I walked up the steps to play the show each night, I shed all problems at the bottom of the stairs. I needed the crowd to love me. Nobody else did, not even me. It can be very lonely walking off stage when you feel like that, when so much seems to be missing from your life. By December of 1977, when we got back to New York, we had sold out 3 more nights at Madison Square Garden. After the first 2 gigs, the other guys met up with family or friends. I found myself sitting alone at Sarge's Deli on 3rd Avenue and 36th Street, eating a bowl of matzo ball soup. On the one hand, now that I was a rock god playing a block of shows at MSG, I assumed I had succeeded in making people envy me and wish they had been nicer to me. But on the other hand, there I was having soup in a deli by myself. That was a harsh reality to deal with. After the final MSG show, Bill Aucoin threw a party at a swank townhouse. I flew in a girlfriend from Detroit. Santa Claus was at the party, and I had never seen so many lobsters in my life. Hundreds and hundreds of them piled up on platters. They must have cleaned out the ocean for weeks. We still didn't understand that we ourselves actually paid for such things. George Plimpton and Andy Warhol came to the party. It was always interesting to see people from other scenes like that, artists, writers, entertainers. Oh, that's George Plimpton. But I didn't function well except in the most socially controlled situations. I didn't want to risk getting shown up. I was too self-conscious. I locked myself in the bathroom with a woman who worked at a radio station. When we finished, we straightened our disheveled clothes and I went back out. Andy Warhol approached me and said, "You should come down to the factory sometime and I'll do your portrait." I'm not cool enough to hang around people like that. I never went. Big regret on that one. After playing 3 nights in a row at the Garden, I knew one thing. What I had thought would fix me had not. If all these people look up to me and see me as special and a star, shouldn't I feel that way? Maybe in theory, maybe while I was on stage, but success and fame and the change in the way other people perceived me hadn't erased whatever was wrong behind the mask. I had reached what I was after, and it wasn't the answer. Whatever was missing was still missing. The question was, what was missing? What was wrong? And just then, as the Love Gun tour wrapped up at the beginning of 1978, a funny thing happened. At what seemed like the peak of our popularity, and when being on stage provided the only respite from my emptiness and my non-existent home life, we stopped touring. In part, it was because we simply couldn't. Ace and Peter were deeply into drugs and alcohol and alternated between hostility and incoherence. When they weren't incapacitated, they caused headaches for everyone around them. We weren't speaking to each other. We couldn't stand each other. We wouldn't play a gig for more than a year. What do I do now? Chapter 33. One of Bill's follies was the movie Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park. He thought that film was the next step for us. The Beatles had A Hard Day's Night and Help, and we should have our film. He sold it to us as A Hard Day's Night meets Star Wars, which had come out the year before. It would have lots of cool special effects. Nobody in the band had the slightest clue about acting. None of us read the script. We didn't care. We trusted Bill's judgment. When we started filming, it didn't take an expert in the field to know we were in deep shit and there was no getting out of it. The director asked us after each scene whether we thought it was good. We had no idea what we were doing. For us, a good take was one where we didn't blow our lines. If we said the right words, we moved on to the next shot. Someone off camera fed us our lines. When we got ready to roll the camera, I yelled, "Line!" And someone said something like, "Gee, Ace, it's time we get going." Then I said, "Gee, Ace, it's time we get going." That's a keeper. It was horrific. It didn't remotely resemble acting. In one scene, we levitated a box using wires. We assumed the wires would be rendered invisible by special effects people. Not so. Meanwhile, the 4 of us weren't speaking unless we were delivering lines. Peter and Ace frequently left during filming. In one scene, we had to use Ace's stunt double, who happened to be black, after Ace left without notice. It was clear as day in the final version that it wasn't Ace. We had to play a fake concert at Magic Mountain Amusement Park for another scene. When we were on stage, I turned around and saw some random old man in cat makeup and a wig playing the drums and chewing gum. Peter had taken off and they threw this guy up there. One bright spot about the production was that we had the Westmores doing makeup for us. They were the first family of Hollywood makeup. George, the patriarch, had set up the first makeup department for a Hollywood studio in 1917, and subsequent generations became legendary for makeup and effects work. Over the years, I had learned the steps and intricacies of applying the makeup to my face, and one of the Westmore sons watched as I did my own makeup one day on the set of the movie. "How'd you learn to do that?" he asked. "I taught myself," I said. "It was just trial and error." "Well, that's exactly the way we would do it," he said. "Cool." When the movie was finished, we saw it at a screening at the Screen Actors Guild Theater on Sunset Boulevard. If you thought it was bad on a TV screen, you should have seen it on the big screen. People openly laughed. I slunk down in my seat. It was humiliating. The finished film was absolutely awful, and to have to stand when the lights came up while various people who had been involved with it came over to lie to me about how great it was made it that much more humiliating. Around the time of that concert at Magic Mountain, Ace had first announced he wanted to leave the band. We held a band meeting on the lot where we were shooting the movie. In response, Bill and Neil had almost immediately hit on an idea to hold us together. "You don't have to leave the band," Bill said. "We'll do solo albums." That turned out to be our next folly. Neil said we would release them all on the same day. He envisioned shipping 1 million of each solo album. Bill had the idea to maintain some cohesiveness by having one artist do all 4 covers, and he suggested dedicating each album to the other guys in the band, to keep up the mythology. Despite the dedications, we wished each other anything but good luck. So, after wrapping up Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, we each went off to make an album with no knowledge of what the others were doing. I had a lot of fun, actually. I didn't want to stray far from what Kiss did, but it was great to be able to work with no tensions, no egos, and surrounded by talent. I started cutting demos at Electric Lady in New York, then went back out to LA to re-record them. After we cut a few of the songs, I realized they just didn't sound right. The demos might not have been perfect or the most fidelic, but they captured what I was looking for, so I decided to keep them and finish them. I liked the spontaneity and rawness. Then I cut another 4 or 5 new songs in LA. I had a band in New York and another one in Los Angeles. The only person who was in both was Bob Kulick. As for the songs, Hold Me, Touch Me was about Georgianne. I had flown off to see her frequently during downtime, and the song came from being away from her and hoping she was thinking of me when we weren't together. Most of the songs, however, were about Carol Kay, a stunner in Bill Aucoin's publicity department, whom I was seeing at the time and was crazy about. She was funny and smart and loved music, and the heat we generated at times could peel paint. Carol was romantically involved with someone else too, and I had been trying my damnedest to get her to stop seeing him. I basked in the drama of that classic love triangle, but I was desperate to pull her away from him. Tonight You Belong to Me and Wouldn't You Like to Know Me are about her. Tonight remained one of my favorite songs because of that tear-your-heart-out passion and pain that I knew so well. Funny, though, because the night Carol finally said, "Okay, I'll stop seeing him," it was as if somebody had turned a hose onto the bed where we were lying. I was suddenly drenched in sweat. I had a full-on panic attack. I searched for the right words, mumbling, trying to backpedal my way out, and come up with a plausible explanation for why I suddenly looked like I'd just gotten out of the shower. The truth was that so much of my life was about chasing approval, chasing acknowledgement, and chasing love, that when confronted with the chance to actually get approval, acknowledgement, and love, I was stunned. The reaction surprised me because in my mind I really thought being with her was the answer. But it was safer to just chase things. I wasn't equipped for the real thing. Needless to say, she didn't stop seeing her other guy after all. I decided to mix my solo album in London at a legendary old-school studio called Trident. I wanted to fly there on the Concorde, something I'd never done. Somewhere over the Atlantic, it struck me that the plane wasn't level. It was flying at an angle. But what did I know? Then the pilot came on the PA and said in a calm voice, "This is your captain speaking. Now, folks, you may have noticed we're flying at a slight angle. We've lost an engine." We're in the middle of the fucking Atlantic with one engine. We're on our way back to Kennedy Airport. If we're flying on one engine, why don't we go down to about 5 feet above the water instead of 55,000 feet above it? The captain came on 10 minutes later. We're using more fuel than expected because we're flying subsonic, so we're not going to make it to New York. That's not good. We're going to divert to Nova Scotia. I don't like this at all. Why are we so damn high up? Before too long, the same calm voice came on again. We're not going to make Nova Scotia. Where on earth are we going to go? We're going to land at Gander Airport in Newfoundland. We need a long runway. We made it to Gander and landed. They paired people up and shuttled us off to a local motel. I said there was no fucking way I was bunking with someone. The next day, a DC-10 made an unscheduled stop and picked us up. They kept us in a sequestered compartment away from everyone else. What should have taken 3.5 hours ended up taking 17 hours. But once in London, I enjoyed it this time. A few months later, when a band called New England that had just signed with a newly formed record label asked me to produce their record, I specified that I would do it only if I could mix it in London. When the 4 solo albums came out in late 1978, you could see the glasses half full or half empty. Selling around 500,000 copies each was nothing to sneeze at, 2 million records if you looked at them collectively as a Kiss product. But since Neil had shipped 1 million of each, what was he supposed to do with the other 2 million copies? It was too much hype, and because of the leftover records, a financial disaster for Casablanca. The solo albums did quell the need for Ace and Peter to leave, but they represented nothing more than a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. They put off something that was inevitable. Chapter 34. Among the people I worked with on my solo LP were 3 girls and a guy called Desmond Child in Rouge who sang background vocals on Move On. Putting up flyers had become a big thing in New York by then, and I had seen one with a picture of these 3 hot girls and a guy. They had a few gigs around the city. I went to see one of their shows in a basement club that held a few hundred people. To be honest, I went because the girls looked kind of sleazy and cool in the picture on the flyer. They sounded terrific. They had a great band, and the 3 girls sang their asses off in harmony. It was sexy and vibrant. There was a Broadway element to their style, a little Brill Building, a little Drifters, and they echoed the romanticized ethnic sound of things like Spanish Harlem. Some of the songs, as well as things Desmond wrote later, like Livin' on a Prayer, which he did with Bon Jovi, told stories about working-class life and had real emotion. We also shared a mutual love of singer-songwriter Laura Nyro. I liked the vibe. I thought it was the best thing happening in New York, and I struck up a friendship with them. When I first met Desmond in 1978, he was living with Maria, one of the backup singers. She was his girlfriend at that point. He had curly hair, kind of like Peter Frampton. There was a sexual ambiguity about all of them that I wasn't quite able to define. I remember the 4 of them being at my apartment one night and thinking, this is all kind of vague. I'm not sure where everyone in this room stands. Desmond and 2 of the 3 girls left. One stayed behind. I now had part of the answer. I had a little crush on one of the other Rouge girls, and a few months later found out in the best way possible that it was mutual. The picture became even clearer when Desmond eventually came out as gay around the time the band put out their second album in 1979. That album was clearly about the turmoil and conflict he felt over his sexuality. I saw the band at the Bottom Line again around that time, and I could see it was over. They all seemed to be fighting for position on stage. Their manager was a travel agent by day, and I remember saying to them, "If you need a doctor, do you call a plumber?" But it was too late. They had been mishandled, there was tension in the band, and the magic was gone. Desmond and I started writing together soon after we met. I would take my guitar to his place, and he would sing along or play a keyboard. The first song we wrote together was The Fight, and it ended up on their debut album in 1978. Then, in early 1979, we worked on another one. It started after a night I spent at Studio 54, the famous New York nightclub. I had heard all these 126 beats per minute songs and listened to the lyrics and thought, gee, I can do that. I went home and set a drum machine to 126 beats per minute and sat down and started I Was Made for Lovin' You. It's funny that some Kiss fans think the song has a sanitized connotation of disco because it was written in a musical whorehouse. Studio 54 was a den of iniquity. It was sordid to a level and degree that I wasn't completely comfortable with. It was hardcore debauchery, sexual relations between everybody and anybody, and drugs everywhere. It was beyond me, but I loved going there to dance. Nobody at Studio 54 wore a white suit and danced like John Travolta. I could go down there in jeans and a t-shirt and dance. Sometimes I'd go there on a Saturday night and not leave until the next morning. I'd buy the Sunday New York Times and read the paper in bed after one last dance with a woman I took home. The music at Studio 54 was all about living in the moment, about having a great time, and so my song began like that too. Tonight, I'm going to give it all to you. Desmond helped with the verses of the song, and eventually, when we went back into the studio to work on another Kiss album, Dynasty, the producer of that album, Vinnie Poncia, helped with the chorus. Bill Aucoin brought in Vinnie, who had produced Peter's solo album, to appease Peter. By this point, we were stuck in an ongoing yo-yoing process with Ace and Peter. Are they in or out? Can we keep this going? Bill and Sean Delaney's relationship was fraying at the same time. Sean was sent off to work on a few of Bill's other bands, and then he just disappeared. We basically never saw him again once he and Bill split up. So Bill needed Vinnie to be the peacemaker. We found out later that anyone hired to work with us at this time got briefed by Bill about what you could and couldn't say to each guy. He made sure we were insulated in this artificial world where nobody ruffled our feathers. People were told what we each liked, what offended each of us, what we each needed to hear. People were paid to tell us what we wanted to hear, and it was hard to make a distinction between motive and heartfelt opinion. We were in an Elvis bubble. People literally held open doors for us. Someone opened the door at the studio, and there was always a catered meal. Bill knew us inside and out. He knew how to placate each one of us and keep us happy. That is a manager's job, particularly when confronted with four people as volatile and combustible as we were at the time. But those people were enablers too. Nobody wanted the gravy train to stop. To Vinnie's credit, though, he didn't want Peter to play on Dynasty despite their relationship. For Peter, Vinnie was a buddy. But for Vinnie, this was a job, and Peter was no longer capable of playing what was asked for and needed. So Vinnie brought in Anton Fig to play the drums. Anton had been in an Aucoin-managed band called Spider and had played on Ace's solo LP. He later went on to play in David Letterman's house band. We worked out a deal. Anton was paid well, but we weren't paying for secrecy. Rumors did swirl that Peter wasn't on the album, but we never felt the need to address them. We never thought about actually kicking Peter out, at least not yet. For now, it would remain the four of us, as always. With Vinnie at the helm, the album wasn't really a rock album. But then again, we weren't really a rock band anymore. We were a bunch of rich guys who lacked a primal spirit. Of course, we also never felt we had to play by anybody else's rules. What was musically acceptable to us broadened over time. For some people, it was fine that we did things our way, until we didn't do things their way. That constituted a betrayal. When I heard I Was Made for Lovin' You being played back in the studio, I was blown away. Yeah, it wasn't Detroit Rock City or Love Gun, but it was undeniable. Another band came into the studio while it was playing, and they loved it too. It was universal, something that grabbed you the first time you heard it. Was it calculated? Yeah. Was it calculated to succeed? Yes, ultimately it was. But was that a bad thing? It started as a challenge to myself to see whether I could write in that style instead of meat and potatoes rock and roll. It was no different from the challenge I gave myself with Hard Luck Woman. The only difference was the style. No apologies for a hit that people worldwide still want to hear and sing along to. The show we mounted to support the release of Dynasty was no longer a rock show. It was more like HR puffin' stuff on ice. It was something that perhaps in some ways we consciously maneuvered toward. Over time, the band had evolved to include a broader demographic than in the beginning, but the change in our live presentation was just one of many missteps made at the time. We wore ridiculous outfits for the Dynasty tour, like Vegas or Disney characters jumping around in our colorful outfits. I don't consider what we normally wear to be costumes, but the clothes we wore on that tour certainly were. I had a layered lavender top. I guess the thought was that the black and silver look we'd always had was too hard-edged, so now we were going to add an individual color for each guy based on the halo color on each of our solo albums. It was horrible. I had designed the stage hexagonal with elevators that brought us up to stage level. We paid a fortune for a laser curtain to ring the whole stage. This was the early days of lasers, though, so they were very dangerous and water-cooled and big. It never worked properly. We spent years in court trying to get our money back for that laser curtain. We also had 2 complete stages built in anticipation of the need to leapfrog to alternating cities. We could add dates in one city while another crew erected the second stage at our next destination, allowing us to satisfy ticket demand in one place and then play the next place without an off date to tear down and rebuild the stage. Without Sean around, Bill brought in a choreographer named Kenny Ortega to try to tinker with the show. Kenny went on to work on stage shows from Michael Jackson and Cher, movies like Dirty Dancing, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and High School Musical, and the music video that some blame for killing Billy Squier's career, Rock Me Tonight. Bill also brought in a guy named Joe Gannon to work as a stage manager and direct our show like a Broadway musical. Perhaps not surprisingly, the tour was in trouble from the start. It wasn't a good omen when our first show was canceled. We figured we would be doing multiple nights in most markets, but for the most part, that didn't happen. We had already had a few 2- and 3-night stands on our last tour in 1977, so what was next? More nights, obviously. Nope. Fewer. The bottom got pulled right out from under us. It was shocking and scary to see that instead of getting bigger, we were getting smaller, as it seemed people were having second thoughts about coming to see us. Why aren't they coming? We had sanitized ourselves and were well on our way to extinguishing the fire that had propelled us so far. We stayed at a hotel opposite the Forum in L.A. when we played there, and I looked out the window and broke out in a cold sweat because I saw so many kids and families standing in line, which at that time could only backfire on us. The line could just as easily have been for the circus. There was an upside, though. I saw a lot of apparently single moms with their kids in tow. I could tell somebody, blonde mom in row 3, have her and Junior come backstage after the show, and then send Junior off for a tour of the stage. But it was all wrong. Peter was completely unmanageable. Whatever we did was never right. If we let him sleep late on a day off, he would get angry and say he wanted to travel on the off day. If we traveled on an off day, he would say he wanted to sleep. If he said it was too hot backstage, we turned up the air conditioning. Then he complained it was too cold. One time he punched a mirror and got a serious deep cut on his hand that needed microsurgery and stitches. It wasn't unusual for Peter to throw his drumsticks at me or Gene or Ace if we stepped in front of his drum riser. Never mind that he was up on a drum riser, meaning we didn't block the audience's view of Peter even if we did pass in front of his kit. If he wants to be at the front of the stage, he should learn to play the damn guitar. But then one night, near the end of the tour, in December 1979, Peter had been binging on drugs and playing particularly erratically. When I turned around during one song and let him know his tempo was too frantic, his reaction was to start slowing songs down and then speeding them up again, apparently out of spite. That crossed the line. It's one thing to sabotage things offstage, and God knows he'd done plenty of that, but this was different. This was in front of fans, people who had paid to see us. Immediately after the show, Gene, Ace, and I spoke about it. We were all stunned by the betrayal. The unspoken rule had always been that you left your shit in the dressing room. No matter what was going on, when we went on stage, we were a band. The stage was sacred. Peter's purposeful sabotaging of the show was the ultimate treachery. We decided we wanted Peter gone. Ace can say whatever he wants now, but he voted to fire Peter without any prodding or strong-arming. It's a tribute to Ace that he did. As far as my own vote, I didn't think it was cold or calculated to dump Peter. It was just survival. Was I going to let his problems drag down the entire band, and me with it? No way. Gene felt the same way. We called Bill and told him we had to get rid of Peter. We said we wanted to cancel the rest of the shows and go home. How could we go on? Bill smoothed things over enough to get us to delay taking action and continue the tour rather than fire Peter immediately. We had just a few dates left. Peter didn't see the train that was about to hit him, but that was par for the course. Immediately after the end of the tour in mid-December 1979, Peter married his second wife, Deborah Jensen, a Playboy playmate. The situation was weird. I couldn't help but wonder, would she marry him if she realized she was marrying the former drummer of Kiss? Early in 1980, Bill had to break the news to Peter that he was out. But instead, Bill persuaded the other three of us that we should give Peter a second chance. So we didn't finalize a decision, and after a few months, a period when we were off the road anyway, recording Unmasked with Anton Fig on drums again and Vinny producing, we agreed to have Peter come back and try playing with us. In the interim, Bill had arranged for Peter to take drum lessons from Jim Chapin, a famous jazz drummer. The day of the audition, or rehearsal, or whatever you wanted to call it, Peter walked in carrying a music stand and sheet music. The first thing he said was, "I'll have to have all your songs on sheet music because I read music now." I whispered to Gene, "Are we on candid camera?" Peter sat down, put his sheet music on the stand, and studied it for a while. Mind you, this was a rehearsal of old material, not the new stuff we had written and recorded for Unmasked. We wanted to see whether he could even play the songs he already knew. The rehearsal did not go well. It was over. My philosophy had always been that if somebody was drowning, you tried to save the person, but when they started to pull you under, you cut them loose. That's what was happening. All the talking and advice and trying to get him help got us nowhere. We shot a video for the song Shandi after the decision to let Peter go had been confirmed. He came to the video shoot knowing it was the last time he would appear with Kiss. At the end of the day, he took his makeup case with him and left. It wasn't tearful, but it was a big moment. Peter was leaving. We had fired him, and this was the last time we were going to see him in the band. Oddly enough, Peter didn't seem to care. He was likely in his own drug haze and saw this as his big opportunity. In his mind, he wrote the biggest song we ever had, and now he was free to go out and become the big star he should be. Wow, Peter's gone. It's the end of something. But the end of what? It was difficult to envision the band not being the four of us. Dysfunctional or not, we were the four musketeers. It was a scenario we had never contemplated. What if somebody no longer wanted to be there? What if somebody was no longer doing his job? Whatever tension there was inside the band, we had always remained a band. Then all of a sudden, one person was no longer part of the band. It shook all of us to the core. What do we do? Do we break up the band? The rules had changed. Kiss clearly wasn't going to continue as it had. Chapter 35. As the drama with Peter was unfolding during the first half of 1980, we were also involved in a drama with our record label. Casablanca was absorbed by Polygram, and for some reason the lawyers of the new company hadn't checked Casablanca's contracts with a fine-tooth comb. Polygram assumed they were buying Kiss and Donna Summer along with the label, but we had a key man clause, meaning that in our case, the deal was predicated on the presence of Neil Bogart. And from what we heard, the same was true of Donna. Now, we may have been in some decline after Dynasty if you gauge things by the tour, when we'd had to cancel some shows and witness the changing demographics of the audience. But the way Polygram saw it, Dynasty had been a huge hit, and in addition to making the charts at home, I Was Made for Lovin' You had been our most successful single outside the United States by far, hitting the top 10 all across Europe and topping the charts in Australia and New Zealand. The label risked looking like idiots if they let us walk away, which we were entitled to do once they canned Neil. The situation could not have worked out better for us. Polygram ended up giving us a new and very lucrative deal as a face-saving move. Negotiating a new contract under these disastrous circumstances for them proved extremely advantageous for us. The truth was that up to that point we hadn't made much money, particularly if you compared what came in with what came to us. We found out later that Kiss brought in about $100 million in merchandise sales in the 3 years between 1977 and 1979. Of that, the band members together took home less than $3 million. The overheads of Bill's operation were eating our lunch. But again, at that point, we still didn't know enough about business to realize it. We had credit cards, but we'd never seen actual money. Still, the idea of having a gold credit card was a big deal. My parents had never had credit cards, and since the bills went to Glickman Marks, who took care of paying them, the cards lent a sense of unreality to the act of buying things. I had a little magical piece of plastic that allowed me to take things out of stores. Now that we suddenly had a chunk of money from the new record deal, I decided I wanted to buy an apartment instead of continuing to rent. You didn't get anything out of renting, you didn't build equity, so in a case like mine, it was pointless. At first, I wanted to look at places overlooking Central Park along Fifth Avenue. When I explained this to a real estate agent, she said to me, "I can take you to the places you want to see, or I can take you to the places that will let you in." "What do you mean?" I asked. She started talking about nouveau riche and about being an entertainer. She paused. Then she said the buildings along the park were owned by blue bloods and old money. She might as well have said, "You're a Jew," which I would learn was indeed unspoken grounds for being rejected by many of the prime buildings I was interested in. My agent had been through this before and knew the situation all too well. "You mean I can't live where I want?" She explained the system of co-op boards. In New York City, most buildings were jointly owned by all the inhabitants, and a board created by the joint owners had to approve any new buyer. It was different from condos where you just bought the unit from the previous owner. Co-op boards could and did block applications to buy from people they didn't want in the building. Jews and blacks were often those people. Eventually, I settled on a place on 80th Street and Madison Avenue, 1 block from Central Park and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I finally owned my own shelter, my home, my sanctuary, my refuge. It felt very different from renting. The apartment was a duplex with 3 terraces. I had a music room, and on one wall I had tall glass front built-in cabinets installed where I suspended and backlit all my collector's guitars, like a cross between the Batcave and a museum installation. The bathroom had a tub as big and deep as a small pool. One day I was paging through Penthouse magazine, and I liked the look of the woman on the cover. I called Bill Aucoin's secretary and said, "Find her." A few days later, she was in that massive tub with me. Cliché or not, there we were with a bottle of Dom Perignon. Not long after, my mom asked me whether I was seeing anyone special. I smiled and told her to pick up the most recent Penthouse. Needless to say, she was speechless at some of the very revealing shots. I have to say I loved her bewilderment at the debauched road I had taken. Over time, my mom grew accustomed to the shocks of my lifestyle and began to view it all with a resigned sense of humor. My bedroom was amazing, too. When you walked in, you saw a black lacquered chest of drawers, and stretching from that all the way to the ceiling was plate glass etched with branches and birds lit from below. It was a room divider. My bed was on the other side of the glass, and above my bed was a huge mirror that kind of flowed out of the etched glass. I spent a lot of time looking up at that ceiling mirror and remarking how great life was. When I saw myself lying next to a beautiful woman, I thought, "Hey, that's me! That's me in bed with that gorgeous woman." One night I was lying in bed with the woman from Penthouse, watching a documentary on TV about the 1970 Kent State shootings during a campus demonstration against the Vietnam War. She started getting kind of frisky, and I pushed her away. "Hang on," I said. "What?" she said. "This is important," I said. "That really happened?" she said. Since I was choosing the women I spent time with based on a single criterion, their looks, I had to expect them to act within the boundaries of who they were. And the fleeting sense of fulfillment I felt looking up at that ceiling did make it easier to be at home rather than on the road. For a time, at least. I started seeing a lot of women around town. At one point, I was seeing 2 different chorus girls from the show Sugar Babies, a Broadway musical starring Mickey Rooney. I took my father to the show one time and we went backstage to meet one of the girls. She was nearly 6 feet tall, exotic, and ravishing. As we walked out, I said to my dad, "She's really hot, isn't she?" "She seems like a nice girl," he said. "She's not a nice girl," I said. "She's just hot." For him, sex appeal and sexuality had to be tempered, sanitized, and neutered. I had found a different point of view and wanted him to know that I reveled in the raw honesty. I had come to grips with the fact that sometimes there was nothing more to it. This woman wasn't nice. She was just very hot, and that was plenty. One morning, a woman called me, and after we talked for a few minutes, I said, "That was a really great time last night." And she said, "Yeah? Who do you think this is?" Oops. Another time, I went to pick up a former Playboy playmate at a new apartment she'd moved into. When I rang the doorbell, a different woman I'd been seeing answered the door. They had moved in together and decided not to tell me. They thought it was hilarious. Believe me, if you saw these two, I was lucky to be the brunt of the joke. I was seeing quite a few women at the same time and went through a period of sending women flowers when I was screwing someone else. If I spent the night with one woman, I'd send flowers to another. It wasn't insincere exactly because I wasn't making any pretense of being exclusive with any of them, but I wanted them all. I was living a triple life. There was the star child, there was me without the makeup, the perceived me, that is, and then there was the real me who, despite fame and adulation, still felt insecure. There was a reason I spent most of my time in my apartment, sometimes with women, often alone. Some people took me for snobby or aloof, but the truth was I was still shy and insecure. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk to people and make friends, it was that I couldn't. I still had just one ear and was deaf on one side. I still shrank back in social situations. I didn't know what was going to happen with my band, which was the only support structure I knew. Now what? The neighborhood around my new apartment had quite a few shops and galleries specializing in Art Nouveau antiques. I had liked colorful Tiffany glass lamps since I was a kid. My parents used to buy old furniture at junk shops and refinish it. Some of it they kept, some of it they sold. And over our dining room table at home hung a glass lamp. It was just an ice cream parlor lamp, but people called any colored glass lamps Tiffany lamps back then. When I moved up near the Metropolitan, I spent time enjoying the museum's collection of real Tiffany glass. One day as I walked past the Macklowe Gallery in my neighborhood, a Tiffany lamp in the window made me stop in my tracks. I still didn't have any furniture in my place beyond the bed and my vintage guitars hanging in the glass-fronted cases lining the wall of the music room. But I went into the gallery to see the lamp up close. The price tag said $70,000. I bought it on the spot and carried it the 2 blocks home. When I got home, I put it down in the middle of the empty living room on the wall-to-wall carpeting and plugged it in. I lay down on the floor and stared at it for hours as the sun set and the stained glass glowed brighter in the gathering darkness. Here I was in my own place with this beautiful lamp. Life is grand. I became intoxicated by the idea that I could buy whatever I wanted. Maybe buying fancy things can make me happy. I would stroll Madison Avenue, see a pair of shoes in a shop window, and ask, "How many colors do they come in? Just give me all of them." I was draping the scared little boy inside me in another image, projecting a big persona with a shell of fine clothes. Once I wanted to go into a jewelry store that had Rolex watches displayed in the window. At first, they wouldn't buzz me in the locked door. Then, after they finally did, they were rude and condescending. After looking around for a little while, I pointed to a watch and asked, "How much is this one?" $20,000, said the salesman, looking down his nose at me. I pulled out my wallet. By this time, we had that kind of cash in our personal accounts and counted out that much in front of him. Then I said, Guess what? I'm not buying it. You shouldn't treat people like that. Chapter 36. Unmasked tanked in the States, and we spent most of 1980 inactive. We didn't have a drummer anyway. The single Shandi was a hit abroad, however, and we booked a tour of Europe and Australia for the fall. But before we could play live, we needed a drummer. Auditioning people was very strange. We didn't want big-name drummers. We wanted somebody to come out of nowhere. It wouldn't have made sense to have Anton Fig or some other known commodity dress up as a black and silver giraffe or whatever. Bill placed a cryptic ad in some music magazines, and we also spread the word. Bill started to get tapes and photos and bios and lots of phone calls. He went through the materials, and we periodically invited groups of potential replacements he had filtered to audition with us. We decided we didn't want a drummer who played like Peter. The ones who made the best impression on us played what you might call English. They played on the backbeat, and whether they were playing double bass drums or not, they revered the same bands we did. Peter had enough trouble keeping time on a single bass drum and snare, so the idea of him playing two bass drums was out of the question. It wouldn't have made sense in the context of what we were doing anyway. Using a double bass drum in rock came about as a way to emulate what John Bonham of Led Zeppelin managed to do with one bass drum. His foot was so fast that it took most drummers two kick drums and both feet to mimic it. We didn't set out to find someone with a double kit, but we also didn't want to impose boundaries or limitations on a new member. As long as we were getting somebody new, we figured we should be willing to move forward. One guy who auditioned was a little stove repairman from Brooklyn named Paul Caravello. He was tiny with a huge head of hair and no airs or attitude. The first thing he did was ask us for our autographs. At first, I wasn't blown away by his playing, but everyone else in the room, including Vinnie Poncia and Bill Aucoin, thought he was great. We brought the guy back for a second time, and he turned out to have a good voice with the same raspy quality Peter had. He was also a quick learner. We had found our guy. Paul wanted to change his name, and we wanted him to change it too. We didn't need three Pauls in the band since Ace also shared that name. His first suggestion was Rusty Blades, which we vetoed quickly. Thankfully, the name game was short-lived when his second suggestion was Eric Carr, a name that sidestepped any obvious cartoon rock star moniker. He seemed like a good soul. Some of the other people who auditioned had acted like rock stars, thinking they would gain points for that. Eric was sweet. He eventually proved to be tortured in his own way, but he certainly was a much-needed breath of fresh air in the wake of Peter's departure. He had told us stories about repairing stoves, going to an apartment and opening up stoves to find all kinds of bugs and beasts crawling around inside. And we wanted him to know he wouldn't be a second-class citizen in Kiss. So once we told him he was in the band, we did two things to welcome him. First, we bought him a silver Porsche 924. I somehow became the guy who was supposed to watch over him and groom him, teach him. He approached me after he got the car. "Can I have it painted camouflage?" "Absolutely not," I said. I didn't think he should take a sleek imported sports car and turn it into a circus mobile. Then I took him shopping at a place called the French Jeans Store. They sold, surprise, French jeans. I helped him pick out a new wardrobe. He'd need it since we were leaving for a European tour soon. It took some time to figure out a character for Eric. Heaven forbid we put him in a character people already knew. That seemed too obvious to us, and maybe sacrilegious. Originally, he was going to be the Hawk. We had a costume built with a protruding chest and feathers all over it. He painted a beak on his nose, but he looked like the mascot for a high school football team. All that was missing were the big foam chicken feet. It was horrible. Fortunately, he came up with the idea of the fox. He wore the same size boots as Peter, so we used existing boots and had the platforms built up even more. The boots ended up being like stilts, and he still looked tiny next to us. Eric got thrown in at the deep end of the pool. We had become comfortable dealing with the world we operated in. Basic stuff, like handling women's sexual advances and the media or acting properly in a restaurant. Eric had to learn on the fly. The second night of the tour, on August 31st, 1980, in Genoa, Italy, we heard a commotion outside the locker room that was serving as our dressing room at the sports arena where we were playing. Then we started to hear people chanting, "Kiss, fascista! Kiss, fascista!" Security started screaming, "Lock the doors!" Baseball bats started pounding on the door and smashing things outside. They wanted to kill us. It was bad enough that we were going to get killed for playing music, but worse still that I was apparently going to die in platform boots and makeup. We consciously avoided espousing any political views, and yet, to them, we represented all the evils of American capitalism. That was the first tour where people asked us about politics. Europeans' way of thinking seemed more tied into politics and world events. Gene took any opportunity to be seen or heard. His Achilles heel is his need for attention, regardless of the source of the attention. I had no intention of making political statements. At the end of the day, Love Gun wasn't about guns. I was just singing about my dick. We had fun messing with Eric on that tour. It was like having a little brother around. One nickname we came up with for him was Bud Carr Rooney, because we joked that he looked like the love child of Buddy Hackett and Mickey Rooney. The first night we were in Paris, Eric wore a brand new white suit to dinner, his first. Not 10 minutes into the night, he spilled a huge glass of red wine all over it. At times like that, he would close his eyes and mutter, "What a schmuck." He sent that suit to the cleaner so many times, hoping against hope the stain would come out, that when it finally came back white, the sleeves fell off when he put the jacket on. He was impressed that we could get by on a little pidgin version of the local language on that first tour across Europe. In Paris, he decided he wanted to try. "How do you ask for butter in French?" "Well," I said, "s'il vous plaît is please, and what you want is fapouge." The French word for butter is beurre. I made up the word fapouge. The waitress came over to our table and Eric said, "Fapouge, s'il vous plaît." She looked at him and said, "Fapouge?" He did this thing we used to call the Ronald Reagan, where his head would start to shake from side to side when he got nervous. He did that now. "Fapouge," he repeated with his head shaking. Another night, he really liked the food we'd had, which had come on a sizzling hot plate. Eric was still like Oliver Twist in those days. "Please, sir, may I have some more?" The waiter brought another searing hot plate, carrying it with tongs, and Eric reached up and grabbed it with his bare hands. You could hear the tss sound as it singed his fingers. He just closed his eyes and said, "What a schmuck." Another night in France, a guy at a nightclub started hitting on Eric, making him uncomfortable. He went over to Ace and said, "That guy over there is trying to come on to me." Ace, in his inimitable logic, said, "Let's make out so he thinks we're together. Then he'll leave you alone." And the kissing began. Armed military personnel guarded the airports in some parts of Europe back then. One time, at an airport where security had AK-47s, Eric got pulled aside. He was wearing a camouflage jumpsuit and bullet belts. They took him through a door and out of our sight, but he was back surprisingly quickly. "What happened?" we asked. "I told them I'm a musician," he said, "so they took me to another room and had me play a piano. Once he played a little piano, they let him go." Though Eric was 2 years older than me, he seemed like a kid. His life experience had been limited and he was naive and gullible. One night in England, he took a female journalist to his room from the hotel bar where we were all hanging out. The next day, we asked him what happened. "Well, we talked, and then she wanted to take some pictures of me without my clothes on," he said. "What?" I said. "She said she wouldn't print them." "Are you crazy?" "Oh shit, did I do something wrong?" "You let her take pictures." "But she said they were just for herself." Sure enough, when the next week's issue of the Journalist magazine came out, there was Eric looking like an idiot, naked in the bathtub with his huge head of hair and a glass of champagne. He closed his eyes. What a schmuck. Chapter 37. The atmosphere in the band was much better without Peter's constant negativity to contend with. It was eye-opening what a difference it made. We had alleviated such a huge problem and so much uncertainty, strife, and hostility. It was as if the sun had suddenly come out, and that was only Peter. Ace was still in a downward spiral, but at least now we had half as much turmoil. Ace had lost an ally, but he hadn't lost a buddy. Whatever relationship he'd had with Peter was strictly mercenary. Ace was smart, and he manipulated Peter to help him vote for things he wanted. If he missed Peter at all, it was on that level, not as a friend. Now it was me and Gene and this other guy who didn't have the same seniority or power as a full member. Ace was the odd man out as far as the decision-making process. I knew it bothered him, but it wasn't an immediate issue while we were on tour. When we arrived in Australia for the first time in November 1980, it quickly became clear that things were going to be crazy. We'd been told Kiss was massive there, but you never know what to expect. You can only comprehend things you've already experienced. Australia was like nothing we'd ever experienced. Huge here meant not being able to leave the hotel. It meant taking a helicopter from the hotel to the stadium we were playing. The phenomenon we witnessed became known there as Kissteria. We had an entire floor of the hotel with one suite devoted to our own Australian public relations staff. And no wonder, since we were on the front page of the newspapers every day, accompanied by headlines like "Kiss and Midnight Cruise on Sydney Harbour." We had to keep the curtains drawn in our rooms. The place was crawling with bodyguards, and there was a constant drone of screaming outside. "You're not going anywhere," we were told. Thankfully, Australia had its own Penthouse magazine, and a number of Penthouse pets came over to the hotel to keep us company. Paparazzi camped in front of the hotel, and whenever we went anywhere, we had to hide on the floors of vans. Every single night, the promoters threw parties which were packed with models and actresses. Some parties were women only. We would show up at a club or ballroom that had been taken over, and the place would be filled with beautiful women. Australia was one giant chicken coop. Eric, however, would often leave the parties and go out and befriend some waif he met on the street. He identified with the fans. Maybe he felt more like them than like one of us at that point. He sometimes brought girls to his room who had been camping outside trying to catch a glimpse of the band. For his comfort, he chose women like that over models and penthouse pets. Issues shape personalities. The first hints of Eric's trouble started to come out, too. One day, he rented a car and driver to spend a day in the countryside with a girl he'd met. He was so nervous, he told us, that he got awful gas and had to stop the car every 10 minutes to go to the bathroom. He was depressed afterwards about what an idiot he felt like. He also went on about how he was losing his hair. His hair was so big that when he moved forward, it moved backwards. It was always moving in the opposite direction from the rest of him. And yet he constantly wanted me to look at his head. "Look, is it thinning here?" And strangest of all, Eric struggled with the idea that he wasn't the original drummer of the band. I didn't understand it. I mean, of course he wasn't the original drummer. He was the second drummer. So what? There was no talking him out of his funk when he started obsessing over the fact that he would never be the first drummer. In Australia, I began to seriously question Bill O'Coin. His cocaine use had become more extreme, and since splitting up with Sean Delaney, his general behavior had become reckless too. One morning I went to his room and found a boy in his early teens eating a bowl of cereal in Bill's bed. Another morning I found a different boy there. Bill was out of control. When we got back to the States, a boy who had won a contest had been flown in to meet us, along with a photographer from the magazine that had sponsored the contest. Bill was clearly hitting on the kid. The next day I said, "Bill, tell me you didn't." "Yes, I did, and the photographer." Bill had crossed a line into an area I saw as criminal and immoral. I was no longer laughing. Back home, the band had more time off. Even though we hadn't toured in the States for a full year, we figured we'd make another record first. We decided to work with Bob Ezrin again, the producer who had served as our captain and Svengali for Destroyer. That was it. We would make another Destroyer. The problem was that the stuff we were writing was no better than the songs on Unmasked. In fact, it was probably worse. We'd lost the plot. My songs were nothing to write home about. Gene's were no better. But then Bob entered the picture, and he floated the idea of a concept album, which really came out of left field. Gene quickly bought into it and came up with a generic, vague, typical concept. It was about a kid who was the chosen one. Bill got behind the idea too. It would be our attempt to woo the critics. Let's put out an album that makes a statement, he told us. One that shows everybody how talented you are. Trying to show people how talented and bright you are is the best way to make an idiot of yourself, and we ended up doing that with flying colors. Looking back, we wanted peer acceptance and critical approval and lost sight of the fact that none of that had mattered to us in the beginning. The people who so vehemently disliked us were more tied up in their own issues than in what kind of music we were making. The fact that the dislike and distaste was so pronounced, almost obsessive, throughout our career should have been a clue that it had little to do with us. If people wanted to waste their time wringing their hands over how much they hated my band, that was pathetic. What may have been more pathetic was that we tried to overcome it by pandering to those people. But we were clueless and decided to try to elevate ourselves, to separate ourselves from where we had started. We assured ourselves that we would impress a lot of people. Finally, we would make an album that garnered critical acclaim, our masterpiece. Gene, Eric, and I moved to Toronto in March 1981 to work on the album. Bob wanted to do it on his home turf. We didn't know at first, but his drug habit was now dictating his choice of location. Ace didn't even travel to Toronto. It's all well and good for him to say in retrospect that he didn't like the musical direction the band was taking, but the fact is that even if we had been doing exactly what he wanted to do musically, he was too wasted to play. He didn't need an excuse to drink. He was a drunk. He was bombed all the time. As work trudged on, Bob's substance problems became so acute he didn't show up either. I had always been aware that Bob had a drug problem, but he had managed it in the past. Now his 24/7 cocaine use had taken on epic proportions. The captain abandoned ship. He was supposed to serve as the visionary behind the concept, and all we were getting were notes sent to the studio by messenger after Bob listened to cassettes we sent to his home. Eventually, we got so far behind in the production that Gene and I started working simultaneously in 2 separate studios, both of us sending tapes to Bob and getting back notes, doing the whole thing piecemeal. We had virtually no idea what the other guy was doing, and we couldn't reach Bob on the phone. His wife relayed messages because Bob was too fucked up to get to the phone. Poor Eric, this wonderful guy who thought he had joined a hard rock band, was suddenly playing gibberish with a fox costume in his closet. He was completely thrown by this band that had lost its way and was stumbling along a ridiculous path. He wasn't comfortable making explicit objections at that point, but he did express bewilderment and discomfort. "You know, this isn't what I was expecting," he said. But he was never in a position to draw a line in the sand. He must have had serious doubts, though. He kept playing us a new band called Metallica. He was into stuff like speed metal and thrash way before we were. The songs we recorded had no teeth. We were gumming the music at that point. We had forsaken everything we loved and embraced. We were intoxicated with fame and success. We were no longer the band everyone loved, and clearly we didn't love that band anymore either. How else to explain the way we veered away from what we did? For a band like ours to be doing something like Music from the Elder truly reeked of the little Stonehenge coming down on the stage during This Is Spinal Tap. If only we had realized. For the cover, we intended to use my hand instead of a model's hand. But the day before the photo shoot, I slammed my finger in a window and had a purple nail that had to be retouched. This should have been an omen. When we were finally finished in September, we went back to New York. If I played the tape for anyone at my apartment, I insisted on silence, as if I was exposing them to brilliance and they had to sit through the entire thing straight through. We also had a listening party for the record company with the same insistence that they listen to it in a manner befitting its artistic merit. The reaction at the end of the listening session was like the audience when they heard Springtime for Hitler from the producers. Mouths wide open. I already knew somehow that it wasn't because the sheer greatness of the album had taken their breath away. The record label hated the album. It was originally sequenced in a way that vaguely told a story. But that meant you didn't get to anything that resembled a rock song for quite a while. So they made us change the order. As if it wasn't already bad enough, they basically did the equivalent of tearing all the pages out of a book, throwing them up in the air, and then binding them back together again. In preparation for the launch, we also changed our image to accommodate how we now chose to look offstage. We didn't want to have long hair anymore. I had razor-cut hair, a bandana around my head, I still needed to hide my ear, and a necklace that looked like I got it from Chiquita Banana. Gene had a little braided ponytail hanging over his shoulder. Ace was still in the photos even though he had in essence left the band. We were delusional. We had drunk the poisoned Kool-Aid, so to speak. I went into a record store down on 8th Street in the Village the day the album came out in November 1981 and saw a poster for it. I had a panic attack. I looked at the poster and it hit me like a sledgehammer. What the hell have we done? Chapter 38. For the first time in the history of the band, we didn't do a tour following the release of the album. In fact, 2 full years would pass between the end of the 1980 Australian tour and the next time we played live in late December 1982. I grew a beard. I spent the bulk of my time one-on-one with a number of women, either ones I knew around New York or ones I flew in from elsewhere. I didn't attend big social events. I just laid low in a series of relationships with multiple women. A swimsuit model I was seeing at the time said to me, "You'll never be happy because you're so tough on people and so judgmental." She was right. At the time, I didn't realize just how right. That was how I functioned, how I controlled the world around me. Everything had its place. I controlled my environment, but I didn't really live in it. Now, I'm not crying in my beer because hanging around with beautiful women was like spending my days and nights at Disneyland, no matter what my motivation was. And it certainly beat the alternative way people dealt with similar feelings of emptiness, like filling it with drugs, surrounding themselves with people who constantly told them how great they were, or winding up blue on the bathroom floor. The allure of buying fancy things was wearing off. I realized while the band was idle that it wasn't about what I could buy with the money. It was about what I didn't have to do. Simply put, money gives you the ability to stop worrying about money. It provides a level of freedom, but it doesn't change you. At the end of the day, you're still the same good guy or the same prick you've always been. Or in my case, the same scared little kid. One afternoon, I asked Kenny Ortega, the choreographer we had used on the Dynasty tour, to drop by. I handed him a suitcase and told him, "Take whatever you want." I sold my collection of vintage guitars, the entire batch, to a dealer for $50,000. They no longer meant anything to me. Luckily, my life turned out all right, and the decision doesn't haunt me, because that collection is worth about $2.5 million today. The racks of clothing and other possessions had become oppressive. Whatever I thought they were satiating, they were not. Ultimately, the stuff became not just clutter, but a looming reminder of my inability to make things right. But I needed to try something else to address the fundamental unease inside me. Then, during a visit to my therapist, Dr. Hilson, he said, "I found a guy for you." "What do you mean?" "I found somebody who I think can do reconstructive surgery on your ear." He had read an article about a Dr. Frederick Ruckert and then tracked him down. The surgeon worked at a hospital in Hanover, New Hampshire, home of Dartmouth University. I was excited. I wanted 2 ears. I flew up to Hanover to meet the doctor. Fred Ruckert was a warm, grandfatherly figure who exuded confidence and security reinforced by all his experience. We hit it off immediately. He explained that the first part of the process would be to remove pieces of cartilage from my rib cage and carve them into the framework of an ear. Then the frame would be implanted and covered with a series of skin grafts. All in all, it would involve about 5 surgical procedures, taking skin and additional cartilage from my good left ear. Nobody my age had ever had the surgery. They typically use this new technique on kids, but given the fact that I had such a tangible symbol and cause of so much pain, why wouldn't I try to change it? Suddenly, I had hope. I hoped having 2 ears and erasing that constant reminder of my childhood would help me feel more complete on the inside. I wanted to move on. The first thing they needed to do was cut out the sections of my rib. Before the surgery, Dr. Ruckert warned me, "You're going to be a little sore." You sometimes hear people talk about being aware of things even in a state of anesthesia. I guess it can be a terrifying experience. I was aware of everything during my first surgery. As they cut my chest open, I could hear what they were saying even though I couldn't open my eyes. I heard the doctor take out the piece of cartilage, heard him carving it, and then heard him say, "That looks good." A nurse agreed with him. The next day, I had searing pain if I tried to move even slightly. A little sore, it felt as if somebody had put a sword through me. The healing process after the skin grafts didn't go so well. Circulation didn't develop in certain areas, and I had to stay in the hospital for a few weeks as they monitored and worked to correct the problems to avoid the skin dying from lack of blood supply. My parents and niece were there with me in New Hampshire. Gene came too. He was going through a period of being very afraid to fly, so I gave him a lot of credit for visiting and really appreciated it. After the first procedure, although it wasn't standard, I opted for a local anesthetic for the rest of the surgeries. So after each subsequent revision surgery, I could walk from the hospital to the Hanover Inn, a cozy old hotel right on the green in the middle of town. I took painkillers and watched TV and slept. It was all part of something very personal, so being alone felt good to me. I enjoyed doing it on my own, and anyway, I didn't know any other way to do it. There was nobody I would have felt comfortable asking, "Will you go with me?" By the time I left Hanover and went back to New York, I was still in bandages and dressings that needed to be changed daily. Normally, a doctor would handle that, but I ended up doing it myself, and I actually enjoyed it because it gave me a sense of participating in the process. It was hard to look at, but it connected me that much more to my own development and, I hoped, improvement. I was also sleeping with protective plastic over my ear that was held in place by a thick leather head and chin strap. I had to wear it for months after each surgery. I always tried to express to Dr. Ruckert the life-changing role he was playing for me. It seemed to catch him off guard when I brought it up. He told me that for the most part he heard from patients only when things didn't go well. He was a humble man who helped countless children avoid the experience and turmoil and endlessly compounded problems I faced as a kid. He helped give me a new lease on life. I gave him a Rolex watch when he retired. I could never figure out a way to truly show him how much he meant to me. Finally healed, I cut my hair short and started hanging out in an Upper West Side watering hole called Cafe Central. I decided to take a break from spending time in music circles. Cafe Central was more of an actor's hangout, a bar with tables, and people spent entire nights table hopping. Regulars included Christopher Reeves, Peter Weller, Raul Julia, and Al Pacino, and Bruce Willis was a bartender for a time.